have a fantastic lineup today to talk about the future of cyber attacks, cyber threats, and cybersecurity. At the far end, we have Samir Chauhan from the UN International Computing Center. We have Khalid Murshid from EAND Enterprise.
We rehearsed on my name, right?
We did. I did my best. Phil Guido, Executive Vice President of AMD, and rejoining us, Roberto Viola from the European Commission. Welcome, gentlemen. Now, cybersecurity is often described at the best of times as an asymmetrical and unfair fight. AI is now definitely part of the problem, but it can also be part of the solution. So, Khalid, maybe I could start with you as a member of the telecoms community. Telecom towers, critical infrastructure, and are often the front line of defense in cybersecurity and often the most highly targeted. How can AI help secure critical infrastructure in countries around the world?
Well, let me start with that. As a critical infrastructure provider in EAND, we have always been entrusted of securing and preserving the data security and the data privacy of our customers and infrastructure, the critical infrastructure that we run. But with AI, and let me say that AI is not a nice fairy tale story anymore. It's something that we're living in. With AI, the level of challenges are stepping up. And I believe that we need to start putting the right balance between enabling AI in our infrastructure, while at the same time preserving and complying to the rules of data privacy and protection. And this is where we come into the picture, because in EAND, what we do is we do cybersecurity, AI by design in cybersecurity. What does that mean? In plain English, it means that we do federated learning models so that you don't need to have the raw data. The raw data stays preserved in their places, and you take the outcome for your threat intelligence and other cybersecurity aspects. And that's very important, because if you start tackling cybersecurity as a layer on top of AI, it will fail, and it will fail miserably, because it will then deal with the consequences rather than embedded in the design. And other things like data tokenization and data encryption. This is something that we have been doing from the start, even before AI. And last but not least, in a very simplified format, why do you push all the data? You need to push the data that is very much needed for a process in particular, or a cybersecurity design in particular. You don't need to push. So data minimization is very important, and that comes also at the core design of how we tackle AI and data security.
Now, speaking of data, Samir, the UN contains an immense amount of data for its member states, for all of its entities, including data about vulnerable groups, sensitive government information. How much harder has your job gotten in the last 5 years with respect to cybersecurity?
Certainly. So, as you said in the beginning, it's asymmetrical, the warfare. And the threat levels that we see coming at us are going up year after year after year, because, as you rightly said, the UN system holds some very sensitive data. And we see ourselves as the custodian of that data. So it's not our data, it belongs to the countries. It belongs to those people that we're serving. So the same as my colleague here, it's the trust we have earned. We need to retain that trust. And retaining it is harder and harder, because the levels of data we are securing, managing, is increasing manifold. The attack levels continue to grow. And we see attack patterns that are very unique to the UN. So sometimes the threat actors that are coming at us are not in it for financial motive. They are trying to get super sensitive information, possibly for political means. So what that means is sometimes how we respond to those cyber attacks or potential cyber attacks is also very unique. And as a not-for-profit organization, or the UN family, budget's always tight. So we have to be very creative in how we handle these threats.
And has AI changed the nature of the threats that you see coming into the UN system?
Oh, massively, massively. I think it has made it, the imbalance that much more. But what we have to do is be smart, is a simple way to put it. So not only do we have to anticipate and design and plan better, knowing the level of threats are increasing, but also we need to take AI and use it to go on the offense.
And if I may, this is a big challenge because people who are trying to use AI in the attacks, they don't care about data protection and data privacy. While using AI in the cybersecurity, we have to balance that with data protection and data privacy. And this is the main challenge, of course, in AI, but this is what we are up against.
Yeah, Phil, I'm curious about the perspective from hardware, because we usually think of cyber threats and cyber attacks as existing on the internet, DDoS and whatnot. But there are things that can happen in the hardware layer that can make us safer, reduce vulnerabilities, and enhance our security in all things. What are you working on at AMD that speaks to this?
Sure. First, thanks for the honor and privilege of being here. As we talked throughout the summit, AI represents a tremendous opportunity to solve some of the world's most challenging problems. But also, as you point out, there's threats. At AMD, we take a multi-layer approach. First, it really starts with the notion of open standards. And that way, the open source community can provide those frameworks, those guidelines to provide that. Within that, we have a responsibility to solutions that we make, whether they're hardware or software. So within the hardware, we'd like to have encryption. We'd like to have, we're developing solutions that are built right into the silicon. But we also recognize that that needs to be auditable. It needs to be transparent, so people can view that. Right? It's trust but verified. In that. And so we also believe, as part of the solutions we're developing in the technology for data protection within the hardware, within the software, that we have a triad partnership between academia, government, and business, that we develop these procedures, these guidelines, as a way it's a transparent view. Because ultimately, as my colleagues pointed out, everybody wants to feel that what they're doing and enabling the technology, but they want to know it's trusted. And so they're putting a lot of investment and a lot of R&D into it. So as we enable the technology, people need to feel the confidence that there are these frameworks, there are these securities to protect the data, to protect the privacies and the laws around the world.
And part of that trust is being part of a community, I would imagine. And so, Roberto, let me bring you in here based on your last conversation. Cyber threats are transnational, they are borderless, and yet our regulations, to the extent that they exist and reflect the AI moment, are either national or maybe regional. I'm curious, how can the EU collaborate with other partners to find a unified approach?
Well, first of all, we are responsible for 450 million people, so it's already a big block. And there, for our domestic cybersecurity, we have a set rule for critical infrastructures and for devices. So we try to tackle both and really pass the message to every stakeholder. Cybersecurity is a state of mind. Means that you need cooperation, because you need actually to speak out about vulnerabilities, because you help others to prevent it. And also, you need to be mindful at every level of devices and not just treat them as black boxes and say somebody's going to fix it. Now, you touched upon the key issue, because these threat actors do not limit the direction to Europe, the US, or the Arab Peninsula. They are everywhere. So there are, first of all, cooperation is very important, multilateral and bilateral level. We have bilateral, for instance, so-called cybersecurity dialogue with our allies and partners, where we go through a number of issues that we have in common and how we can reinforce. And of course, we exchange information, and that's very important. Then we set standards. For instance, one of the things that the whole community needs to do very quickly is to adopt the so-called post-quantum encryption, which is an encryption system that can resist to the attack of a quantum computer. So it sounds very technical, but it's very material because, I mean, the quantum computing is coming, and with a quantum computer, you can break whatever traditional encryption system. So this is an effort that requires standards and international cooperation. The same in hardware. I mean, you need standards. And then in ransomware, there's a so-called an alliance to counter ransomware, which is a worldwide alliance, where we can do a number of things. We can isolate and exchange information about cyber criminals, follow the money when ransom is paid, and also help companies to deal with the problem.
Excellent. Now, let me follow up on something you just said, because each of you work with many stakeholders around the world. There are many, many governments represented here, many of which are smaller than others. I'm curious, all the security you're describing sounds very expensive. How can countries or customers with smaller resources, how can they participate in this fight? How can they protect themselves against such an asymmetrical enemy? Maybe Samir, start with you.
Sure, I can start us out. So, as the UN system, we work with all 193 countries, and the problem you articulated is very real. We have to make sure we can level the playing field. So part of what we do, and when I say we, it's the broader UN system with organizations like ITU and UNDP and others, is to help level the playing field, help each country build capacity. So what that means is put them on a journey, teach them if they're willing or if they want us to help, on where are you today in terms of your cybersecurity posture, how do you move up to the next level and the next level, what will it take, help find the right resources. It could be funding, clearly, but it could also be technical capability. Can we bring the experts to the table? Can we retrain their national certs? Tell them how to handle these new threats that are coming from AI. So we see that as part of our responsibilities to help level that playing field and bring the countries that are a little bit further behind up to par. And to do it, again, very smartly and creatively, to say maybe we can leapfrog a few generations. Let's not try and deploy a technology which existed 5 years ago. The world is changing so quickly. Let's help them if they're building new capabilities that are appropriate for the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a big focus for us, yes.
Now, Khaled, as well, I know there are many, many markets for EAND, some of which are less developed than others. What should they be working towards to get up to speed?
I think there has been a time where cybersecurity was a luxury to be implemented. This is definitely not the time. And we believe that cybersecurity is not just a layer that we implemented on top of any technology. It's an ecosystem. And in E-Enterprise, we realized this early down the journey. And we provide that from the infrastructure side, all the way to the cybersecurity layer and the security operation centers. When it comes to investing in, let's say, less fortunate country who cannot afford to have expensive R&D and expensive tools, we can always have remote services that cover the countries on those domains. But I think the most important part is to educate them, as Samir was mentioning, educate the technology roadmap to implement state-of-art technology that embeds cybersecurity in the design of those technologies. Let me give you an example. For example, there has been a cloudification journey in the past few years, and people did not realize the importance of sovereign cloud until recently. We've always been talking about public cloud, hyperscalers sitting somewhere outside of the country, but today, all of the hyperscalers, and we work with pretty much every one of them, are offering state-of-art sovereign cloud depending on the workload that embeds security at the very core of the design of that infrastructure. And this is a very important thing. If you try to adopt the wrong technology, it's going to be more expensive later on to secure it. This is the rationale that we are working on.
Well, picking up on that, sovereignty is an interesting question in the age of AI for any number of reasons. I want to follow up, Phil. You mentioned open source, and critics of open source AI believe that open source AI models are destined to fall into the wrong hands. Now, cyber criminals are already at an advantage. Surely open source will empower them more. Roberto, let me bring you in on this. Is the responsible thing for governments to ban open source models?
No, I don't think this is the way to go, but indeed, I mean, we have to be mindful of making sure that AI is used for good and in a good direction. That's why it's important to make sure that AI is developed and thrives where, I mean, also thrives with values. And in this, it's also important, also for open source, to track and be sure what is going on, where this software is going. And also in terms of training facilities, I mean, not everywhere is the same place. I mean, there are distinct differences in the world and distinct risks. So we need to be mindful that open source is probably the future in medicine, in transport, but at the same time, security is very important, and that requires a 360-degree approach to it.
Are you all in favor of open source AI in cybersecurity?
I personally believe we need to look at all options. And again, the UN's perspective is each country should be making the right decisions that are right for them. But we can be one of the sources that can educate them. So whether it's open source AI or the stack it runs on. So we're looking at sovereign clouds for countries, we're looking at private clouds for countries, sometimes private clouds running on an open stack. So the countries have the flexibility to build it on a stack where they choose, if they decide to move tomorrow onto another comparable stack, they can. And similarly with AI, to help them choose the right models. That if they build something, one, they can own the IP of the end product of all the analysis they do and the national data they bring in. But secondly, give them guidelines on how they can potentially move if this stack, including the AI models, long-term don't end up being the winners or have certain security concerns. So best we can do is empower them, guide them, but open source has a very strong role to play in this, in my opinion. All the way from the hardware, open source hardware, to the cloud stack, all the way up to open AI models.
But to pick up on the point, I think a key element of the principle of open source is that that drives collaboration and innovation, but it gets shared with everybody. And so that's kind of an equalizer around the world. So you then bring innovation, you bring in collaboration, and then you bring best practices that get deployed all over the world that's shared.
In my opinion, open source or not, you need to own your own destiny. And you do proper design for your infrastructure, you do proper design for your data classification, and then you decide what goes public, what goes private. Then whatever changes later on, you are owning your own destiny. The posture at your end will not change because somebody decided to change the open source or proprietary. This is very important because this is an evolving market and it's an evolving industry, and we cannot control all the variables. What you need to do is to design your roadmap that will ensure the data protection and the data privacy for your own critical infrastructure, and then work inside out rather than accepting everything from outside.
But we make in the European Union an important distinction between the open source community and what happens, which of course, I mean, we very much respect this openness. You cannot make the community liable if something wrong happens, and the responsibility of critical infrastructure providers or hardware providers when they actually use open source in providing a product. Then at that very moment, they take the responsibility, because at the end of the day, somebody ought to be responsible for having placed on the market or operating an infrastructure. And this is the important difference. So use open source as much as, possible, because it's, as we all said, it's very good. But of course, when designing the product, the responsibility is on the supplier or on the operator.
I think responsibility is a good word for this because something that's unique about cybersecurity is that many of the worst offenders are state actors. Samir, some of them are your members, which must create some interesting meetings.
Well,
I'm curious, how can we encourage responsible use of AI in cybersecurity, given that states themselves sometimes use it for aggressive ends? Samir, how do you handle that conflict internally?
It's not an easy one to handle, honestly speaking, because yes, all the member states fund the UN, and yes, we have situations where potentially, in some cases, the state actors are the ones who are trying to exfiltrate the data, let's say, or do cyber harm. I think we in UNICC especially, we are the operational arm. We are we are the technical muscle, implementing all the digital capabilities, providing cybersecurity capacity. So we have explicitly distanced ourselves from saying we will not do attribution. That's not our job. Our job is to best defend and protect our partners and through them the world. So we focus on that aspect. But we have to acknowledge that, yes, state actors have a big role to play. And that question becomes bigger when you start looking at AI. Because even with AI, every country, every region has the right to, and they're designing their own open source models. But is there bias in there? Is there backdoors that are being built explicitly for the purpose to eventually be able to exfiltrate or use the data for malicious intent? Yes, you have to be very pragmatic about it and acknowledge that's a possibility. You just need to have different layers of safeguards and controls around it. To say if this that you're deploying is fit for purpose, this AI solution, for example, but there is a certain percentage chance that there may be certain potential complications long term, let's have enough layers of security and protection around it to make sure that you minimize, that's the best you can do, minimize the potential impact. You have to educate the operators. So if you're talking about countries, end of the day, it's their data, it's their citizens, it's their national employees who are operating these. They need to be educated and armed to make the right decisions.
And Roberto, let me ask, are you optimistic that we will be able to have regulation that can hold even state actors accountable for cyber attacks and cyber threats as they grow more sophisticated with AI?
I'm not only hopeful, I'm certain because we do have it in the European Union and already sanctions have been activated for organizations linked with state actors that attack at the European Union. We are constantly under attack by state actors on our physical infrastructure and our IT system. The state actors steal our data, steal industrial secrets, and put also the privacy of people at risk. So we take it extremely seriously.
Good. In our remaining time, I want to ask about business, because businesses are, of course, major targets of cyber attacks, whether it's corporate espionage or small mom and pops dealing with deepfake mail orders and all sorts of shenanigans. I'm curious, Phil, start with you. What can businesses be doing to future-proof their own cyber strategies as AI R&D moves faster and faster and faster?
A couple of things. One, I think ethical AI, what we were just talking about, is essential in an AI world. And, we need to hold ourselves accountable to a higher standard in business. And so one of the things at AMD we did about 5 years ago, we published a white paper on ethics of AI. And within that, we layered the things that we needed to do is we build solutions and capabilities of, how do we ensure fairness, privacy, security, in everything that we do. So one example of that is when we started to think about our models that we were developing, how did we make sure that they didn't have biases in them? So we go through an internal process of really, truly vetting to make sure that we maintain these high standards of integrity, fairness, and security within that. The key then for us is then not to stifle innovation, right? Because at the end, we're trying to bring, solutions to the world And so we constantly look at the standards that we need to adhere to, but also how do we then, again, back to the open source, back into the guardrails that we need to put out there in a community to share that and be part of communities that enable that. And so, you know, we're involved in many, whether it's nonprofit organizations or, you know, collaboration with academic, government, and business to make sure that we bring these to life and to bring this. It's very complicated, and it's only accelerating, but as long as we stand up to higher standards and we share these, and then we make sure that they're transparent and they're audible, then people will be more confident in the technology.
Khaled, same question. What advice are you giving to your enterprise customers right now?
I think few points, and I can talk about each and every one of them, you know, extensively, but maybe not. This is another forum. So the first one, as we mentioned, and I believe ethical AI is the most important part. But how do we walk the businesses or enterprises towards ethical AI? And I think the balance between the adoption of AI, you know, and ensuring that data privacy and data protection is very important. And I mentioned that in the first question, that has to be part of the design. So I'm not going to elaborate on that. But the second part, which is the biases, AI model will give you the results based on the data sets that they have been trained on. So as part of AI adoption, there should be a process of continuously measuring and training those with new data sets that ensures that those biases are minimized or disappears over time. On top of that, there should be proper committees or, let's say, framework that governs, number one, the risks associated with the AI adoption. Number two, the possibility of data breaches and the misuse of that data. And there should be a process around what do we do if we discover a possibility of breach. Because this is something new, and we haven't had that before. And with the AI adoption, the increase in AI exposure, in data sets exposure will also arise. So it's going to be built on top of that. Last but not least, we have to invest in the proper training for our human capital to face the new challenge. It's a new challenge, it's a new technology. How do they handle it? How do they deal with it? To be honest, we were one of the early adopters in the regions of AI. And this is how we realized 4 years ago that our fresh graduates intake are all going to be called AI graduate trainees. It's us realizing that the human part of the equation is the most important part. Even if AI is the most autonomous technology ever built, we believe that the human as part of that equation is the most sophisticated and the most critical element of the whole equation to make sure that we are not overdoing things and going into a wrong direction.
So maybe last question then, we're almost at time. I'm curious for each of you, what is a practical step that the policymakers who have joined us at WGS today could take when they come home as they prepare their economies and their populations for the types of cyber threats that they'll be seeing in the future? Roberto?
Well, different things that need to be done. There's not a magic solution for everything. We discussed, for instance, having good rules in protecting critical infrastructures, having standards in place, and if necessary, rules in making sure that the supply chains are protected and trustable, and make sure that cooperation is there, because confessing a cyber incident is the first cure to make sure that then there's remedy. I mean, that's why we insist very much on the disclosure of vulnerabilities in hardware, disclosure of accident. Of course, sometimes not in the public street, but I mean, in trusted circle, in a way that things can be prevented. I mean, people learned the hard way, for instance, the financial sector. They were not sharing data. And then they started to understand that, big frauds, scams, cyber attacks come first in one place, and then they propagate. And then they started to be much more cooperative. This needs to be accelerated. The other thing is, think the unthinkable. The pandemic has shown us that there are not things only happening in science fiction movies. They do happen. So contingency, preparedness, security policies in place in order to make sure that you are well prepared. That's why, for instance, I mentioned moving to post-quantum encryption. So plan and think ahead.
Plan and think ahead. Phil.
I think I agree completely, and I think one thing is they go back to their constituents. They really need to look at their current programs, their policies, their procedures, and really do, in my opinion, like a gap analysis and where there's areas or vulnerabilities that they need to remediate. And if there's areas, then they could start to take a look at a multi-level approach. Look at some of the communities, the partnerships, collaborations between academia, business, and government to really have a full 360 perspective of everything. But the main thing really is they got to go really inspect, verify, and making sure that there are gaps, they put programs in place to remediate them.
Khaled, tell us.
Well, as a critical infrastructure provider, we have the key word, as Your Excellency mentioned, is collaboration. And public-private sector collaboration for us has started from the beginning. Now, we are a private company. However, we collaborate with all the security-related authorities in the country. And I think this is the key foundation of our, co-owning the cybersecurity responsibility. But before that, you need to start implementing your self-implemented regulation. Things that, because you are the technology provider and you would know in many ways how this technology can be breached. So the self-implemented regulations are the first steps. And then you have to adopt the international standard. State-of-art international standards, international technology standards are very important also, and they will eliminate a lot of the threats and a lot of vulnerabilities. And as I said, complement that with a co-ownership and a co-creation of those regulations. And I'll give an example. In UAE, we have the regulatory sandbox, which is nothing but a controlled environment where you can come and test all the sectors, private, public, entrepreneurs. They can come and responsibly, in a safe environment, test AI solutions and the cybersecurity based on AI solutions, so that we can all have that common understanding and common level of knowledge of what are the threats and what are the advancements of the technology.
Very good. Samir.
It's hard to go last because lots of amazing things have been said already, but I'll try and complement that to the best I can. So I think to your question about how can we educate the governments and the policymakers, step one is education. I think it's such a fast-moving space. Even for us technologists who are doing this for a living, it's hard to stay on top of it. So to me, education is very important. And forward-looking education, not to say what were the lessons learned, what did we do wrong, that's useful, but it's moving at such a fast pace, otherwise we'll always be playing catch-up. So it's almost anticipate where it's going and start to, with the education, start to define policies, guidelines, governance structures that are ready for the next year and the year after next, if you will. I know it's aspirational, but that's what we should be guiding the governments to do. Secondly, I love this idea of sandboxes. In the UN context also, we are building sandboxes. That's a great way to take that knowledge or learning, which may be more theoretical, and then let's say pilot it, test it out in a safe setting to say, what if we use this? How will this play out? What are the implications? Bring diverse stakeholders to the table so they can all sit there and analyze. And that will allow the governments to fine-tune those policies before they go live with it. But I think that combination of those two is very important. And in that stakeholder map, as you sit down and have these discussions around the sandbox, you need the private sector, you need academia, you need civil society, governments, the UN, everybody, in my opinion, should be there to provide their insights and guidance. And last point is, who is the final decision maker? That should be clear within each government, to say who will make a decision, knowing that there's no perfect decision. Choose the right one for now. Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you.
Perhaps we can have this conversation next year in your sandbox, Rod. I want to thank all of our speakers.